Welcome to Energy in the Room. I'm Katie. Join me as I sit down with the inspiring voices shaping our energy future. Together, we'll share real stories, big challenges, and honest advice from those leading the transition. Let's dive in. Joining us today is Shane Quinnell, Head of Development at Westwind Energy. It's hard to give a worthy introduction, I think, for Shane, given all the things you've achieved and been involved in. But in summary, Shane's got over 13 years experience delivering large-scale renewables projects across Australia and internationally. Shane is also one of the most passionate people I've met in the sector, someone genuinely driving impact, hence why we want to hear from him. So welcome, Shane.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. How did you find your way into the energy industry?
It's a funny story, actually. So ironically, I found my way into renewables from coal, actually, funnily enough. So I effectively finished university at the University of Queensland up in Brisbane. And following that, I did quite a long trip through South America and Canada and a few other things, effectively trying to run away from the office and the concept of being stuck in an office for the rest of my life. And then continuing that theme, I decided to go and work for a coal handling company out at Middlemount Coal Mine in sort of northwest Queensland. And after about 8 months of being in northwest Queensland at this coal mine and getting given effectively the tailings dams, which weren't working, and going through a conversation where the company at the time said, look, don't worry about it. You know, if the tailings dams flow into the river next door, that's kind of acceptable. You know, really realized that I just wasn't in the right place. So at the time, I'd sort of been considering options in terms of what I did. And
what year are we talking here?
We're talking around about 2012. And so basically, you know, I was originally South African a long time ago, and the renewable energy industry there was really kicking off. And I had a girl that I wanted to go back and see that I'm now married to. So basically bought a plane ticket to South Africa, and just decided renewables was what I wanted to do. And part of it for me was that I'd grown this real passion for the environment and sustainability and all these other things because through uni, I'd grown a real passion for adventure sports, and I'd been in nature and I'd seen, you know, and experienced how awesome nature was, and then also experienced how we were impacting it. And so there became this drive to try and do something that could leave a legacy of helping protect it and, you know, create a better place. So I bought a little motorbike. I literally, you know, ran LinkedIn to find every renewable energy company I could find in Cape Town, and then rode this motorbike and just basically found the name of the managing director and would walk in and say, hey, I'm here to see whoever. And eventually, ironically, having just moved back from Australia, but as a South African in South Africa, got a job with WindLab, who's kind of the quintessential, you know, Australian renewables developer. Eventually convinced them to let me work, you know, for a very minimal salary for 3 months on the basis that if they liked me, they had to keep me. And, you know, that was that.
Did this all stem from you going around on your motorbike?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, I basically would rock up on my little motorbike and, you know, just sort of walk in and go and have a chat. And often the gatekeeper would walk out and they'd be like, you here to see who? And, you know, I'm some 22-year-old or something. And they were like, what are you here for? And I'd make some story up. And, you know, eventually half the time I'd get through the gatekeeper. And so, you know, I met Peter Venn, who was then the managing director of WindLab, and I met a guy named Francis Jackson, who was basically the head of development for WindLab South Africa, and became a mentor of mine. And they just gave me a shot, and now I'm still here.
Yeah, I think people say it's not what you know, it's who you know, but that really simplifies it. Like, you clearly went all guns blazing to try and get yourself into meeting the right people.
Yeah, and I think part of it for me is that, you know, there's a lot of people that sit there and go, oh, I want to do this thing. And let's just say, for example, let's get a job in renewables. And they go, oh, but I've applied for 5 jobs, 10 jobs, 50 jobs. And you kind of go, yeah, but you're doing the same thing that every single other person is doing, right? And if you've got no experience and you've got no credibility, and by the way, you've got an accent from a different country and you've just finished university, what's the differentiator? So for me, it was, if I do the same thing as everyone else, I'm going to get the same outcome, which is going to be really hard. And admittedly, like, it still took 3 to 4 months of me driving door to door. And, at the time I was working on Table Mountain as an abseil guide at the same time, just to supplement income. But for me, it was, to your point, like, it was, how do I do something different? And it might not work. And a lot of people probably would get really embarrassed by it. But to me, it's just, well, let's just make it happen.
It's got to be done.
Yeah.
So to get a bit more specific then, like with your early career, is there a time that you can pinpoint that shaped the way, like maybe that attitude or the way you view the work that you do?
I think WindLab was pretty formative in shaping my view, for a couple of reasons. One was that I think renewables is a really interesting industry where, particularly historically, but still today, a lot of the people in the industry, probably a disproportionate amount compared to a lot of other industries, genuinely care. And they're there because, yes, we want to develop infrastructure and stuff, but the reason we want to develop it is because of the fact that we're trying to create change, and we see the work that we're doing as kind of a medium to allow us to do that. And so there were people back in WindLab South Africa who, like Francis Jackson, were there for the same reasons. And so I had a couple of those experiences where, and WindLab was really, really good at the technical side of wind energy, and they were great at finding good projects from a wind perspective and etc., but also try to find that line between social and environmental responsibility. I then worked for, various companies in South Africa. I worked for a guy named David Wolfram, who became a very, very good mate of mine, with a company called WK and Wind Current. And that was probably another one where, we worked pretty hard, but we had board meetings in the sense of we'd go surfing at lunchtime. So, it's this attitude of like, how do you do something and work really hard at it, but how do you genuinely have fun doing it? And we'd go on, multi-week road trips around South Africa looking for sites, and we'd go surfing, at these cool spots. And
Yeah.
it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. I think you and I have known each other for about 9 months or so. And I feel like you have brought that mentality throughout your career still now. Like, what you're doing is really important. Take your job very seriously and what you're doing, but you do try and, it's your life, and you do try and make it fun at the same time where you can.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I find really interesting is that people try and create these segregated buckets. And what I mean by that is, it's kind of like, this is who I am at work, and this is what I do, and this is who I am in life, and this is what I do. And it's kind of like, well, work is a really big part of life. And by the way, you're not a different person when you rock up at work or when you rock up in life. So, clearly I've still got long hair and a few other things, which probably raises a couple of eyebrows, but, like, you can still get stuff done and be yourself. And it's really funny. I rocked into a meeting the other day, with some bankers, and I had a suit on and I had a skateboard under my arm, and these bankers were kind of sitting there and they were like, mate, did you bring a skateboard to this meeting? And I was like, well, yeah. And they were like, why? And I was like, well, because I had to get around the city and it was way more fun than just walking, and it's way faster, so it's more effective. And they were like, man, you renewable energy guys, right? Like, you're just different. But the irony is that people don't find a problem with it. They love it, right? Because you're not trying to be anyone different.
Yeah. It makes you human. It makes you just a normal person that people want to work with, want to understand, trust, all the things that make things tick along, for sure.
Yeah. And look, I think the other thing there is that, like, A, it's more genuine, but B, I think one of the big challenges we have today in society is this concept of how to find balance, and balance between how do we work as hard as we're working and get stuff done, but avoid things like burnout and, stay sustainable. And like, I haven't really burnt out badly, but I have been through burnout a bit. And what I've found is that when I start becoming too serious, and when I lose track of all that other stuff, that's when those kind of things happen. So I think by finding, and it's not necessarily balance in the sense of you're not working long hours or you're not trying hard or whatever. It's
Yeah.
just, it's almost just caring less, like
Yeah.
caring less and caring more at the same time.
Mm. And I think a lot of the time in the working world, like whatever sector you work in, I think resilience is always a word that comes up. And I think that's such a misused word in a way. Like resilience can mean so many different things. And you're right. Like, I think there needs to be a balance of, like, what is just actually overworking yourself and caring too much. And from the outside, someone might look like the most resilient person with, like, keeps getting knocked down, but just keeps pushing through these, like, to get to these milestones and stuff. But actually, is that too much?
Yeah, and I think to that point that one of the ironies with resilience is that putting on a facade is not resilient,
Mm,
right? And there's a lot of people who are very good at, to your point, outwardly seeming resilient or seeming like they're okay, but internally are really struggling. And
mm,
I think if we can acknowledge how we're doing and, and work on that and just sit with it, the ability to be genuinely resilient
mhm.
is a lot easier.
Yeah, it's like the byproduct.
Yeah.
Um, and talking about resilience, I think you genuinely are a resilient person. So I know you've been through an experience that is totally life-changing, to be honest. So you have to share a bit about that and how that's shaped who you are and where you are.
Yep. I'm assuming you're talking about my paragliding
I
accident.
am. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Crazy, crazy stuff.
yeah. So back, I can't even remember when it was, around about probably 2015. I basically was flying a paraglider, a few hundred kilometers north of Cape Town. Did a lot of flying. I actually learned to fly in Colombia in Spanish, having only learned Spanish a couple of months earlier, which was really interesting. But yeah, I was flying in a straight line, and next thing you know, my wing pretty much imploded. What we think happened was I hit a dust devil, which is like a whirly wind, like kind of invisible.
A dust what?
We call it a dust devil, yeah. So, when you
Dust
see
devil.
kind of little cyclones out in the
Yeah.
outback or whatever. But anyway, my wing basically just fell out the sky and I was a few hundred meters above a mountain range. Long story short, basically looked down and there was the only set of high voltage power lines on this entire mountain directly beneath me. So then it turned out my wing was actually tied in a knot. So when I managed to recover it, I started spiraling out of the sky. Sort of delayed throwing a parachute because I thought I was going to land in the power lines and would probably have cooked myself. So delayed it a bit, then threw a parachute eventually. At the last minute, a gust of wind hit me and it slungshot me straight back into the mountain. So I effectively saw this mountain coming at me and I was going, probably 80 to 100 Ks an hour. And older paragliders had always said it's better to break your legs than your back. So if you're going to hit something, stick your legs out. So I stuck my legs out, and I ended up crushing both my legs and then hit my back, broke my back, and basically landed on this mountain. And
Sorry to interrupt. Do you remember this at the time, or is this what someone's told you?
no, I was completely conscious the entire time. Yeah. So I was really fortunate in the sense that I absolutely obliterated the bottom half of my body, but somehow, other than a small graze on my face, didn't hit my head.
Mm.
But it did mean that I was lying on this mountain for like a good hour or two before anyone came. And somehow my radio had been malfunctioning. So I could hear all my mates going absolutely crazy because they thought I just died. And my cell phone went flying. So I had no communication out. So yeah, I effectively lay on this mountain until a farmer came and found me. And yeah, it was kind of ironic, but I'm lying on this mountain really broken and I had to calm this other guy down and because he was just completely freaking out. And he just said to me, he's like, what can I do? What can I do? And I said, man, like, chill out. Like, please go and phone a helicopter and just tell them where I am. Like, go find my mates. And, he was completely freaking. But anyway, long story short, spent like a good few weeks to a month in a hospital bed, kind of unable to move. Spent 3 months in a wheelchair, had to learn how to walk again. Yeah, it was pretty interesting.
The fact that you just brush over, had to learn how to walk again, like that is just, I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, I think it's, a lot of people have asked me, well, I've heard this term, had to learn how to walk again. What does it mean and how did it feel, right? Um, in my case, what it meant was that, I'd been incapacitated for so long that I had no muscle in my lower body at all. Like, it was basically just bone and skin.
Mm,
And B, my ankles had been in like exoskeleton external fixators for 3 or 4 months and they had not moved. And the problem with joints and stuff is that when they don't move, they completely lock up.
mm,
And then you've got the fact that you haven't had pressure on your feet for 4 months. So,
mm.
the day that they eventually said I could relearn to walk, I was super excited because I was like, oh, getting back to life. And they put me in between parallel bars. Um, and other than the agony of having first broken myself, like I've never felt anything like it, right? Like it was
Mm.
almost as though I was standing on two hot plates with like needles and like burning nails coming through my feet. And then you try and walk and you realize that your legs don't work properly and you
And
realize you can't move
surely
my
up here,
ankles.
like that mental mountain is maybe the hardest part to it.
I think the mental mountain is a really, really interesting one.
Mm,
What happened with me was that a few weeks after the paragliding accident, I had this experience where I was sitting there and I could start feeling my psychology going down, right?
mm,
And somehow, fortunately, I had this moment of kind of lucidity where I sat there and I looked out the window and I went, well, I'm here in this hospital bed and this sucks, but actually it's a beautiful day outside. And by the way, I'm still here. And that definitely wasn't for granted. And I've basically got this choice. And my choice is, do I allow myself to go down this black hole of depression and whatever else? And by the way, it's going to suck for my girlfriend. It's going to suck for my friends. It's going to suck for me. Or do I just kind of accept it and choose this other pathway, which is the fact that I can't change it?
mm,
And actually, like, I've got really good healthcare and my wife or my partner comes and visits me every other day. And I've got mates that are streaming in and out and we come play bongo drums in the hospital bed and irritate everyone and focus on that.
mm,
And the really interesting thing was that at the time, that was like this fundamental shift for me where it went from going down this black hole to just stopping.
mm.
And actually I then really enjoyed this experience of like having time and, like I sort of half learned Portuguese from the bed and like I had wheelchair races with my mates up and down the corridors and at the time, and I did a lot of speaking about it, like retrospectively, and I thought originally that what had happened was I had made the choice to be happy and to focus on that, which I did. But
Yeah,
what I,
that's how I'm seeing that. Is
yeah,
you got to a crossroads,
but the
didn't you?
irony, right, and the thing that I only realized through doing a lot of digging at it is that until and unless you've fundamentally and completely accepted where you are, you can't make that choice.
Mm,
And then when I looked at my story of like, this paragliding accident, ultimately my wife and I turned it into kind of a sponsored expedition where we climbed Africa's five highest mountains and we got sponsored by Suzuki and whatever. And when I looked at that, like all the way along, there were these points in time where I got to significant adversity. And it wasn't until I accepted where I was that I could actually move on. So I suppose for me, like, and coming back to your piece around resilience, like to me, the fundamental tenet that most people forget is that it's actually acceptance, not choice, that
mm,
drives outcomes in terms of resilience.
mm, mm. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it is an incredible story. And I guess it sounds cliche, but it's obviously shaped the way you you are and the approach you have to things. And it is really incredible. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Um, and then yeah, obviously I said you are so passionate about the energy sector, which is incredible. Like we need people like you in the space, not just a box ticker and things like that. Someone that genuinely wants to drive the impact. I think you and I have had discussions before about the changes that the industry goes through, the state of flux that we're in with things. Um, So just like a pretty blunt question, what is there a particular problem or challenge in the sector that you feel drawn to solving?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think to that, and just to expand on it, I mean, admittedly, I haven't worked in other industries for a long
Mm,
time, and I've only spent bits and pieces at the start of my career. But one of the things that I think is really important to understand about renewables is that renewables is one of the biggest changes that we're going to see in our society in recent history. Like it's equivalent to we're effectively changing the whole way the energy system works, but at the same time, we're transitioning from a fossil fuel dominant economy to this place of electrify everything, and therefore demand's going through the roof. And and we're stuck in the middle of that. And what that means is that we're effectively changing unintentionally the incumbent status quo. And whenever those kind of changes happen, there is a lot of pushback, whether it be politically, socially, etc. So in my relatively short career, like I've seen some unbelievable stuff in terms of intervention from politics. And in South Africa, back in about 2016, it got to the point where legally the CEO of the government-owned utility had to sign power purchase agreements because companies had met their condition precedents. And the president phoned him and basically just said, do not sign them because I want to build Russian nuclear, right? And there was a whole bunch of really bad reasons as to why he wanted to do that,
mm,
including bribery and whatever. But that's the background of, how much intervention there's been in renewables. I suppose my opinion today is that we're at this really interesting inflection point because recently we've had the federal election and we've seen Labor get back in, and it wasn't the only thing that we were deciding on as voters, but one of the major things was this difference between renewables and nuclear, right? And personally, I don't think that there was any genuine intent in the
mm,
nuclear sort of discussion at all. I think it was really just political. And I say that from an engineering point of view, ideology completely
yeah.
aside, right? Like time and cost wise, it just doesn't work for the problem they're trying to solve.
Hmm.
Um, and so we've now, like, the industry is seeing Labor coming back in as a really big indicator of let's speed up. But it's a little bit like hurry up and wait. And I say that because even although from a target point of view, federal governments and most state governments are saying speed up, here's our target. Let's, you know, convert to renewable energy, partially for net zero, but partially because of electrification and the need because, by the way, like it or not, coal's going to turn off. We're seeing additional red tape, green tape, et cetera, come on board until you look like an elf at Christmas time, right? And like it's just kind of slowing things down. So there's this real irony of policy setting targets, which
Hmm.
are accelerants, but then policy setting targets, which are decelerants at the same time.
Hmm.
And, I think it will get worked out. But my concern at the moment is that I think we are running the risk where building out energy in the next, medium term is going to be complicated. And I think the possibility that we're going to see coal closures starting to happen because, by the way, the plants are starting to break down and there's issues with the energy system, and that renewables is not coming online quick enough,
Mm.
in my opinion, is a possible problem. And part of the problem here is that we've just been arguing for so long over should we, shouldn't we, should we, shouldn't we, to the point where we haven't actually been strategic in how are we doing it.
Yeah. With whatever answer we go for,
Yeah.
how do we do it?
Yeah. And unfortunately, and I know this is one of the topics you wanted to talk about, part of the collateral here is actually communities, because communities have been kind of pulled backwards and forwards, both as voters and as pawns and as all sorts of other things in this debate of, you know, are we going renewable? Are we not? Why are we going renewable? By the way, it's like, and then there's heaps of misinformation that comes out
Mm.
about renewables, and the amount of confusion out there in the energy space, particularly among communities and councils and things, but also even among the energy industry,
Hmm.
is pretty huge. And then you start considering the change in the rural environment, and it's kind of unsurprising that people are frustrated.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right. Like, it is something I wanted to talk about because for the last 6 months, a lot of the challenges that I know developers have come up against, and a lot of the hiring needs that people have asked us for are for community engagement specialists. And yeah, I guess it's just this finally people have recognized that to develop and deliver successful renewables projects, the community and stakeholder engagement piece needs to be done right from the offset and early days. Like, it's not just a nice to have person in the business. It's like a strategic person that needs to come on board and totally own the community engagement piece. So it's definitely something that, like, a conversation that's been coming a lot with clients and people in industry that I speak to. And coming back to the actual communities, like, I agree. I don't blame people for being so frustrated and confused. So that then leads on to my question about if you could go out into the community and just kind of give one piece of or, like, I guess, bust a myth. Like, what is it? Or a misconception? Like, what was that one thing that you would just say, look, trust us on this. This is true, or whatever, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think part of it, and coming back to that point where we were talking about around acceptance and resilience, is the why. So why are we doing what we're doing?
Yeah.
And the reason we're doing what we're doing is that Australia needs energy, right? Like, energy is now almost an essential service. Like, it's not quite the same as water and those other things, but it is seen as essential to keep society running. The issue we have in Australia is that the majority of our incumbent generation is turning off, right? Because it's old and it's broken and it doesn't cost it. It's not cost effective and whatever. So not only do we have to replace that, but we've then also got this hugely growing energy demand, which I think we touched on earlier, from things like EVs and electrification and et cetera. And then we've got AI coming in and we've got data centers. And so you add those two things together and suddenly you go, hold on, we need a huge amount of energy to keep the lights on really fast. And then you add in the fact that we've argued about it for years and years, and you go, well, hold on, we haven't actually planned this very well because we've been too busy trying to bicker about whether we should or shouldn't rather than just getting it done. So if you underpin that why, and that transitions into change is happening. It's not a question of will change happen, and it's not a question of will we be building, wind farms, solar farms, et cetera. It's simply a case of where and how.
Mm-hmm.
Because as a society, we actually don't have a choice. And I think, one of the really interesting things that I've found with communities is that communities, like, they're just people. And they're people like you or I and like us, they've got priorities for family and for, finances and for healthcare and for all this other stuff. And I had an experience where I went out to a community kind of before the original Albanese election and then after. And a few of the people pre the election were pretty anti because they were saying, oh, well, there's this other option. I can't remember whether it was gas or coal or what it was at the time 4 years ago. And I then went back to the same people about 4 months later, following the election of Albanese and the 82% target and et cetera. And they were like, well, this thing's happening now. We can't change this. And so we might as well get on with it. If we're going to get on with it, you guys seem like reasonable humans. Treat us decently and we'll work with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to get to that point where we can have a real conversation about why are we having it, how are we having it, and the fact that change is going to happen, so let's do it the right way.
Mm-hmm.
And to stop, misinforming people and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I think it's human psychology, isn't it? We do not like change. So just doing whatever you can to build that trust. Educate sounds patronizing, but educate people on, what is it going to look like, make them feel supported. Because it's not a case of if it's going to happen, it is going to happen.
Yeah. And I think it's a case of having a real conversation, right? Like, The irony with communities is that, and they will tell people from the city this all the time, but we often don't listen, is that they just don't want us to beat around the bush. Like,
Hmm.
communities will accept a firm, respectful no,
Hmm.
even if it's to something they want, quicker than they will respect, a political response of, oh, we'll try, but we
Mm.
don't know if we can, but we'll whatever, and then nothing ever happens.
Yeah.
So I think I think like being really clear on boundaries and being clear on what we can do and what we can't. And there are things we can do. There are,
Mm.
like the ability to potentially shift turbine locations or to reduce impacts or to whatever those things are. But I just think that clarity of having that conversation really openly and genuinely, and actually, if we can change things, change them. If we can't change things, then have that discussion
Yeah.
is a big part of it.
Yeah. And I think obviously you have genuine people in the industry, genuine businesses and organizations. Do you think that for those that perhaps don't have the mindset that you've got but are still working in the industry, do you think that the current legislations are enough to keep people in check and doing what they should be doing, or do you feel like there should be more um,
It's
legislation
a
put in
really good
place?
question. And, just by the way, again, this is really topical. Like, we've seen some really major planning changes in Queensland in the last 6 months,
Mm,
which have had a pretty major impact in terms of investor
yeah.
confidence. Like the Queensland Renewable Energy Council's April survey, which is an update on a survey that I think happened about 6 months ago, shows that policy stability, which was previously the fourth or fifth highest risk or concern for investors, is now number one, like
Mm,
top of the list. In addition to that, it showed, and I speak under correction, but I think it was around about a 50% decline from around about an 85% um, positive rate of investing in Queensland to around about like 35% or something, or whatever
mm,
it was. So there's been this market impact, but one of the things the Queensland government has come out and said is that their reason for implementing a lot of these changes, which is part of the intent, is to try and effectively enforce community engagement and to enforce good behavior,
yeah.
because communities were getting increasingly anxious and frustrated about the way things were happening. So I think there's two answers to this question. The one answer is that I think corporates and organizations need to realize that it's not a nice to have. And whether you're doing it because you're being genuine, which I hope you are, or whether you're not, the reality is that if you don't get community right, it can and will be a major risk for your project.
Yeah.
And so there's this need there, and I've spent a lot of time, over a long period trying to communicate this point, because it's something where for years, to me, the writing's been on the wall. And I struggle to conceive how industry doesn't see that. And, a lot of people do. I think and coming back to one of my earlier points, like a lot of people in renewables genuinely care. Um, and also there are people who, for whatever reason, have had less focus on that. And to be honest, I think one of the things to understand here is that the people that are not necessarily going out and engaging as much as certain others, it's not necessarily because they're bad actors, and it's not necessarily because they don't want to do the right thing. It's potentially because they see risks in terms of being drawn into the political media ping pong match between conservatives and non-conservatives and like all of that other stuff. So it's often coming from fear rather than from not wanting to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's you're so right. Like I think it's that's the phrase I always or have been using is it's not a nice to have to do the community engagement piece right. It's like it's critical.
But I think, and just to wrap that up in a bow, the other thing to be aware of is that community engagement is hard to get right. And it's hard because it's not a hard skill. It's a soft skill. And, it's not like
Yeah,
you
that's
don't
a
like,
really
you
good
don't
point.
go to community and go 1 + 1 = 2. We've got this community that's made up of a heap of different
Hmm.
people. And by the way, we're engaging tens of stakeholders all over the place, and each one has a different perspective. And we're trying to help have this engagement, but it's not landing.
Mm.
It's quite sort of esoteric and it's community it's hard to get right. And
Mm.
it's something where I think sometimes industry gets a bad rap, even although a lot of people are really trying. So, coming back to your original question about legislation, I think legislation has to be set up as guardrails. You are never going to be able to legislate every outcome. And by the way, if you try to, what will happen is you will inhibit businesses and industries and communities from getting genuine outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And one example of that is, for example, like setting up guidelines or regulations that are too prescriptive in terms of you have to give this bucket of money to this group, because what that does, it takes away the flexibility and the creativity from me getting a social impact assessment, getting the outcomes of that, and then working with community groups based on what they actually need, based on what they've told us. And it just goes to a transactional approach of you're doing this, they want that, so you give this to them, but it forgets all these other groups over here.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be cautious of how we legislate. I think, yes, legislation in terms of mandating community engagement and stuff is positive, but there are unintended consequences which can be pretty problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think up to this point, it's clear that the industry is pretty turbulent from a lot of different aspects. I think I've heard you describe development as snakes and ladders.
Yeah. It's more like it's funny. I talked to someone else about that, and they were terming it as just snakes. Sorry, they were kind of like, I've never really had
Where
a
are the
ladder.
ladders?
Like where are the ladders that skip 20 pieces on the game board? Right? It's like I found a cobra and I happened to slide down to 0, but I haven't found a ladder yet.
Well, the ladders will come.
Yeah, I think they are coming.
Just be resilient.
Well, I think they are coming. I mean, we've seen in places like New South Wales increasingly trying to offer pathways to expedite, planning approvals. And we've seen the project priority list at the federal level, which is trying to earmark projects. So I think the ladders are coming. I don't know if they're working that well at the moment, but I think at least there's the intent there.
So with all the snakes and some ladders, maybe, what do you think's one thing that people in the industry should not lose sight of?
I think the big picture. And what I mean by that is that often, and I think this is a human phenomenon, but we get really caught up in the day-to-day of, we've got this problem, we've got that problem, and by the way, some policy came out and it's frustrating, and policy's changing, and there's all this hysterics. Like if we cut that noise and we just dial it back, the reality is that Australia is going through a period where coal is shutting down, and whether it's 5 years or whether it's 7 years or whether it's 10 years, who actually really cares? I mean, yeah, it makes a difference. And actually, contrary to my comment I just made, it'd be really good to get some clarity on that. But also it's happening. And by the way, energy need is increasing like a rocket. And I don't think we've seen anything yet. And the reality is that something has to plug all that energy, which is needed to power our homes and our cars and, all our lights and our offices and all this other stuff. And the only real thing that can do that with enough volume, quick enough, cheap enough is renewable energy. And that's not an ideological statement. Like you take climate change away, you take sustainability away. The reality is that currently there is no other real technology that can be deployed fast enough at a reasonable cost of energy to fill that void. That there is gas which can help to peak, but by the way, gas is a much more expensive technology, and it's part of the story. So I'm not saying that renewables can or should be 100% right now. But the energy mix in terms of the build out, it's the most sensible technology that's been proven to work. And if we consider that, and we consider that we've got this huge energy need and it's the technology that can work, the reality is that somewhere, sometime, we're going to just have to start putting heaps of renewables onto the network. And so, yes, there are problems, and yes, we need to focus on them and we need to fix them. But the big picture and the target, coming back to the federal target of 82% renewables by 2030, like that's a clear indicator of what the government is saying they need.
Mm,
So if we accept there are problems and we focus on them, but we don't
mm,
like agonize over them and we just focus on solving them, let's just get it done.
yeah.
And probably the final thing to that, and going back to a book that was written by Ross Garnaut, who was the chief economist of one of the prime ministers. I can't remember if it was Kevin Rudd or someone, but he wrote this book called Superpower, right? And it was a book where it described the renewable energy opportunity for Australia. I think one of the issues is that we're constantly focusing on problems,
Mm,
and we're focusing on the issues with community, and we're focusing on the issues with renewables and the issues with politics. Why don't we start focusing on the opportunity? And the opportunity here is astronomical. Like, we've got
mm,
a technology where Australia has like some of the best natural resources in the world. We've got space, we've got the ability to have an industry that can actually drive this. And,
yeah.
that creates jobs, it creates lower cost of energy. And, by the way, there's a whole heap of Asian countries just up the road who wish they had those things because they don't know how they're going to power their countries with
Mhm.
decarbonization targets.
Yeah.
So like, how do we increase those opportunities, reduce the risks, but like, let's focus on the good things, right?
Yeah. And again, what do I know? But I think that with the recent election results, maybe we have kind of gotten over the hurdle of less toing and froing now. And what is it, 82% renewables by 2030? Like, do you see these next 5 years? Like, are you hopeful with that? Or do you feel that there is an awful lot to do to get there?
It's a really good question. Look, I think I'm probably an optimist by nature.
Yes, I would say so.
But I would say like I've also seen quite a lot, right? And I would say I'm cautiously optimistic.
Hmm.
Um, there's a lot of question in the market and in the media about is 82% renewables by 2030 achievable?
Where are we at now?
It's a good question. I think we're around about sort of 45% or thereabouts. Um, Look, it's going to be really hard. But also I don't know if that's relevant. And the reason I say I don't know if it's relevant is it kind of comes back to that quote, like aim for the moon and you land among the stars, right?
Mhm.
Like whether we achieve 82% or whether we achieve 83% or 70% or whatever that number is, who actually cares?
Yeah.
Like the reality is that we've got a heap of stuff to do really quickly, and we need to find a way to do it in a manner that builds trust and builds the
Hmm.
opportunity and builds better outcomes for stakeholders, plural, and that includes communities and includes industry and includes government. So let's focus on that.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it comes down to everything. Like, you have to have goals, you have to have targets. But personally, I really agree with you of like, well, if we have those goals and targets, obviously we're going to do our best to get there and do everything we can. And if we don't quite get there, but we get to 70% or whatever, then
Yeah.
at least something's been done.
Yeah. And look, I think probably two other things. One is that the power of targets can't be overstated. And
Mm,
it's interesting because like in my personal professional life, I historically have been somewhat hesitant with the idea of key performance indicators and, driving people with them because I think sometimes it creates misaligned behavior between teams and stuff like that. But retrospectively, um, you know, Lightsource was a company, for example, that was driven a lot by end of year targets to achieve financial close on things.
hmm.
They did a staggeringly amazing job at getting things to financial close. And part of that was driven by the fact that everyone had a common goal. They were very, very clear on what they needed to achieve. And, we found ways of pulling rabbits out of hats like every other day to try and solve problems because we had this focus. So, I was having this conversation the other day where someone said to me, oh, well, don't worry about it. Targets are not that important. We don't need them. Industry will just be fine. And I was like, mate, like, I don't think you get it, right? Like industry needs targets and we have to have a guiding star because without that, we're all just floundering. Like it's a bit like getting in a car and putting your GPS on the dashboard, but not knowing what your
We'll just
destination
drive.
is.
Yeah.
The only other thing, to your earlier comment of like, do I think we can get there and will it be hard? The answer is yes, currently it will be hard and it'll be very hard. And the reason is that to my earlier, comment, we are setting targets, but we are not setting the policy to align with those targets from a whole of government approach. And so, we've got planning legislation that, like, in some ways slows us down and doesn't create the right stages to align with projects. And so it is absolutely critical that we find a way to try and align policy with targets and to try and find ways of keeping assessing projects, but allowing them to move at a speed that allows them to achieve those targets. The other thing which there needs to be a real focus on from my point of view is the cost of energy. So the renewables world, like, house building and like every other construction, the costs have increased dramatically since COVID. We've seen very big cost increases, which is affecting that LCOE, or the levelized cost of energy. And unless and until we can solve that problem, we're going to start having difficulties in terms of getting projects to financial viability, which means they can't get constructed, which means they can't generate. And there's a few things in that in terms of the way that our grid process works and the ability to leave competition among different suppliers and manufacturers, which currently we're inhibited from as developers because of the way we're being forced to develop projects.
Yeah. It's an absolute minefield, really, in my opinion. But it's been great to get your perspective on things and hear about your opinions and advice. Really, really grateful. We have a tradition that we're going to be doing on this podcast for guests to recommend someone that they'd want to hear about or hear from on the podcast. So who would you recommend that we have a chat to?
It's a good question. I would say probably the person that I'd be most intrigued to hear from is Matt Keane. So he was the previous energy minister here in New South Wales. And I think one of the things I really admire about Matt Keane is that even while he was in the Liberal government and broadly, they were more or less kind of opposed to renewable energy and going for other things, as a treasurer and energy minister of New South Wales, he was pushing renewables as both an economic and social imperative and priority. He's now obviously working elsewhere and he's not in politics, but I think he's someone who's got that view of how the political alignment works in Australia. And he also, really understands the science and the economics behind it. So yeah, if you can get him on board, I think it'd be awesome.
Matt Keane will come on Energy in the Room.
Yeah.
We'll give it a go.
Give it a go. Set a target.
Thanks so much, Shane.
No worries. Thanks for having me.